If you exist in the gaming sphere, I'd wager you've come across the name Hideo Kojima at least once. And if somehow you haven't, I'm sure the name Metal Gear Solid might ring a bell or two. The famous auteur is a figure who is known arguably just as much for his own person as he is for the games that he creates, which is saying a hell of a lot when you consider how influential his work has been for the entire medium. I personally was a late bloomer to his games. Metal Gear is a cultural mainstay at this point, so while I was of course aware of its existence, it wasn't until Metal Gear Solid 5 came out where the gameplay caught my eye enough to finally reel me in. And while I enjoyed my time with that game, it still wasn't later until COVID when I finally dove into the rest of the franchise from the beginning. And the rest is history. So, in an industry where the creators and teams of designers behind your favorite games tend to be unknown background figures, what is it about Kojima that captures my and the world's attention? And what is it that makes his work so special? To answer that question, let's first take a look at the man's influences. Kojima isn't someone who talks very much about his own life in interviews, but the one thing that is abundantly clear is his reverence for Western media. One of the few things we do know comes directly from his book of essays, The Creative Gene. He and his family had always been huge movie watchers, but it wasn't until after his father died when he was around 13 years old where he doubled down on the solace that he got in movies, books, and television. As a result, around that time he was consuming tons of media from Japan, but also America, which he found a deep love for to the point that it became his primary obsession. Armed with the desire to become a filmmaker, he found himself in the next best medium, video games. Right from the beginning, you can see Kojima's aptitude for innovation. On his first gig, he gets assigned to lead a project called Metal Gear, which was supposed to be a military action game released for the MSX2. The system's hardware was fairly limited, and it was making development of this kind of game difficult. So armed with inspiration stemming from the 1963 film The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen, he pitches a different kind of game that's focused on sneaking rather than shooting. In a reversal of the traditional shoot-'em-up genre, he envisioned this more as a puzzle game about how to get around these situations instead of engaging them, which was totally unique for the time, and also a clever way to avoid the technical issues they were running into. So just like that, in a moment's notice, he basically pioneered the entire concept of stealth in video games and produced a massive hit for Konami. Every thread that runs through his productions can be seen forming here at the start. First is his seemingly innate penchant for innovation, able to come up with new systems and crazy ideas at every turn. Second is his love of Western cinema and how it directly influences just about everything he creates. And lastly is the complete control that he executes on his productions in order to deliver his singular vision. I think that Kojima's love of Western pop culture is one of those things that endears him the most in the public eye. If I didn't convince you of this yet, maybe I can now. Metal Gear's titular character, Solid Snake, a reference to Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken character from the films Escape from LA and Escape from New York. Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater, one giant homage to the Cold War era James Bond films. I mean, just listen to the theme song for God's sake.
I give my life, not for honor, but for you. In my time, there'll be no one else.
What about the cassette player you get in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain? It's full of as many American 80s hits that Kojima could fit in. And now what about Death Stranding? Well, this game contains fully motion captured performances from every American celebrity he could possibly convince. Norman Reedus, Lea Seydoux, Mads Mikkelsen, Margaret Qualley, Guillermo del Toro, and even Conan O'Brien.
Oh my god. What's wrong with you?
The sequel that's coming out this year is only adding more to the roster. And then look at his social media. You'll find daily pictures of the songs he's listening to, the movies he's watching, movie reviews straight from the cinema. Even celebrities coming to visit his studio seemingly every other week, like Timothée Chalamet. Starting to get the picture? From an outside perspective, it doesn't even really make sense how he's obtained this kind of fame in an industry of mostly unknowns, but this is part of the charm. Some people see this as him cozying up to Hollywood since he's made it clear a million times that he loves movies and always wanted to make them. While I can see why people might feel that way, I don't agree because of this next point I want to make, which is his uncompromising visions. Yes, it is true that he brings in every big-name celebrity he can get, but if he wanted to attract even more and use that as a stepping stone into Hollywood, he could easily produce something more accessible, but he doesn't. He remains uncompromisingly weird in himself. We live in a time where more and more games, and honestly just media in general, feels like it gets made by a board of directors, dictated by what is needed to make a profit or attract the widest audience it can. That's why we still need creatives like Kojima. He has a complete vision of what he wants to make, and he follows it through to the end. Despite how weird and even not quite understood Death Stranding remains, it's supposedly still turned a profit. At least enough to allow for a full sequel to be made, as well as letting him greenlight 2 other projects, OD and Fizzin, which we still don't know much about yet. The most common opposition to how I feel comes from those who find this weirdness pretentious, or that his games have an air of being overly self-important when it's nonsense. There have always been those who thought this, around the time of the original trilogy of Metal Gear games, grew much louder by the time of Metal Gear Solid 4, and definitely hit its most vocal with Death Stranding. And once again, this is fair. Metal Gear Solid 4 is famous for having around 9 hours of cutscenes, with the final one lasting 71 minutes, which was enough to garner a Guinness World Record. This is easy bait for those on the whole Kojima just wants to make movies train. I want to break for a second to talk about another prominent auteur, the late and great David Lynch, who you might know for Twin Peaks, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, and so many others. Lynch is one of my all-time favorite film directors, and he falls into that same polarizing category of artist where his work is either viewed as the greatest piece of fiction in mankind or incomprehensible nonsense. Also similar to Kojima, the man is widely adored as one of the kindest, caring, and freely artistic minds in his industry. Pretty much every actor he has ever worked with has praised him as a friend and collaborator. Yet even with all of that heaped onto him, Kyle MacLachlan, the star of Twin Peaks, had himself said he doesn't fully understand what the show is about on a literal level. The thing is, though, it almost doesn't matter. What he excels at is expressing feeling. Sometimes the actual plots or events you're watching unfold are weird and nonsensical, but that story and imagery evokes a vivid feeling in the audience that drives home his messages and themes anyway. There are always people who are going to say that this is pretentious and that you're looking for meaning where there is none, and these people aren't necessarily wrong for having that opinion, but I do think they're missing the point. This mirrors exactly how I feel about Hideo Kojima. He isn't the strongest writer. Death Stranding has a ton of huge infodump cutscenes where characters spout about the history of the world and vomit vocab words about bridge babies, the beach, chiral networks, cryptobiotes, and on and on and on. Sometimes it can be too much, and I admit that this got a lot worse by the time of Death Stranding's development. But one thing is still clear. The feelings that he can evoke through this world are truly sublime. It's unlike anything I've experienced before. Kojima uses this strange post-apocalyptic mailman game to get across themes of connection, hope, humanity, and rebuilding. And what is so impressive is that you could skip every cinematic in the game and still receive this message just through your actions in the gameplay, because it's seeped into every facet of the experience. This is also why, at least in Death Stranding, it's fair to criticize some of the writing, because you don't need characters to talk about reconnecting every other sentence and explaining the themes out loud. I think this is a symptom of having his own studio now where there is nobody to reel him in at all anymore, which is the flip side of having that much creative freedom. Sometimes it feels like he gets worried that people won't get it, and so his characters will often monologue pretty blatantly about what things mean. This is why to some it can come off as preachy, but I think it's balanced out by a sense of self-awareness. I mean, after Death Stranding gets going, the first song that comes on while you're approaching your delivery point is literally titled "Don't Be So Serious" by Low Roar. Metal Gear Solid has always had a tone that would balance out extremely serious topics with clearly tongue-in-cheek camp, and I think people forget how much this really has been prevalent in his stories since the beginning.
What's with these guys? It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Even though his games are full of cinematics that do sometimes border on being too long, there are fantastic revolutionary games in there too that still feel new to play. As far as Death Stranding, I don't know if I would agree with Kojima 100% about it being an all-new genre of game, but I strongly believe that those leveling the walking simulator insults at it just didn't play enough. The game itself is extremely unique, and the traversal mechanics and pseudo-multiplayer systems are definitely something we hadn't seen before. It's polarizing, a theme that I've constantly repeated throughout this video, and I can get why to some this wasn't the game that they expected. But he's still the same innovative auteur that he was since Metal Gear on the MSX. Some people don't want a movie mixed in with their video game, and that's fine. But this interesting media hybrid style that he has was instrumental in basically launching the video games as art sentiment alongside BioShock. And to that point, I think it's unfair how much Kojima will now get criticized for these things, although I do think he could use an editor or partner to rein him in a bit in a very George Lucas way.
It's a little disjointed.
Seems like a lot of short scenes.
It's bold in terms of jerking people around, but I may have gone too far in a few places.
Now let me wrap it around to the beginning to answer the initial questions that I posed about why the games of Hideo Kojima matter. Not everything he's gonna make will be a home run, and that's part of what's great. He's willing to create new things, original worlds and stories, new styles of gameplay, bringing in celebrities to use crazy experimental levels of motion capture, mixing in film-level cinematics, and no matter how weird or offbeat it may be, he sticks with it and releases it to the world. I understand that his level of fame is what lets him do this, and I of course wish that every developer equally had this opportunity, but unfortunately it isn't the way the industry works. For example, Sam Lake is another auteur who, just like this, deserves his own discussion. We live in a time where the games market is dominated by titles like Starfield, Avowed, yearly Call of Duty releases, and new Fortnite modes all the time. And for the record, I have played and enjoyed everything that I just listed. But lately, we've been getting used to new releases that are just safe versions of things we have seen a million times before because studios don't want to take chances. I know that there are indie titles that fill this niche and that deserve to be supported, but Kojima is one of the few that gets to do this on a AAA level. Even the discussions about whether he's profound or pretentious prove my point in of itself. He creates conversation and discussion about new things we haven't seen before. So the fact that Death Stranding has been so polarizing was a refreshing dialogue to be part of. That's what art is all about. Now, the purpose of this wasn't to defend every little thing he does and explain why his work is immune to criticism. Everything people say is perfectly valid, and if you find things like his name being plastered into every set of rolling credits pretentious, I'm not going to change your mind. But sometimes it's okay to play something that challenges your expectations. You might come away not enjoying it, but still finding the merit in what was brought to your screen. To me, this is the fun of Hideo Kojima productions. At the end of the day, there's a place for both Fortnite and a Death Stranding in your repertoire, because they're both pieces of art that just offer different things. I only wish the latter would get the same kind of funding. For me though, he combines a level of production, style, cinematic language, and innovation that just scratches this very particular itch, not to mention that the music is always spectacular, whether it's licensed or his scores. I will forever remain seated for what he cooks up next. His experiences are unforgettable packages, the likes of which you can't get anywhere else, and that is why Hideo Kojima matters.